Let's talk about authentication in Windows 10. There we go. This goes with the overall security theme in which AAA. So in security, we want to authenticate who you are. We want to authorize what you're allowed to do, and then we want to audit or account for everything that you're doing, create logs. So this is the first step, authentication, knowing who you are, which is kind of critical if you want to secure things. We have to know who everyone is. All right. So user accounts, local versus domain versus Microsoft account. So we have peer-to-peer versus domain. So there's a couple ways we can handle authentication in the big scheme of things. We can do a peer-to-peer authentication scheme in which if we have multiple workstations in a network, this is writing extremely fast, so let me clear that and start over. Let me draw a laptop here. All right. That's better than what it was. All right, so there's my laptop. We have another laptop. They're getting worse. And then here's another laptop. I realized probably should have pre-hashed laptops I could drag in here. All right, but the point is they're all interconnected somehow, right? They're all connected to each other on the network. All right, so the big question is how are we going to authenticate to these laptops, right? We can all have our own local databases. That's my drawing of a cylinder, excuse me, with a hat for some apparent reason. But anyway, we have a cylinder here with our local SAM database, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But we have our local SAM database on every single laptop. That's a peer-to-peer authentication scheme. And the big takeaway from that, which is a bit of a nightmare, is, but it also can be empowering, that every single workstation here, so let's label these workstations, A, B, and C. All these workstations here have the same amount of authority to authorize someone as everyone else, which leads to the disaster scenario that if I log in here, if I'm user 1 and I log into A, but I want to log into B as user 1, those user 1 credentials are going to have to be created in B. If I don't want the user who is initially creating it, user 2, to know what my password is, they're going to have to pass me their laptop in order for me to type in my password, or assign me a password, which then at that point they would know, although they could make me change it to the next login, which we'll talk about as an option. But every single laptop is as powerful as any other laptop. There's no central authority. That's a peer-to-peer authentication scheme. It also gets confusing if you have a printer in the scenario, right? We have a printer plugged in, and my printers are awful, never mind when I'm drawing with a mouse. So say we have a printer in the scheme here connected up to my laptop. That printer, if I want to make sure only certain users can print to it, again, I would have to have a local authentication, as well as shares, any shares I have on my computer. Again, it can get really messy really quickly. Versus domain. So if we just throw one more device in, and we're going to talk domain as the central authority, because this is Microsoft/Windows class. So if we have an Active Directory server, so this is running Active Directory, not AB, but AD. We'll get that in there. All right, so if this is an Active Directory server, what would happen is all of these workstations, and even ideally this printer would be plugged into it, would then look to the authentication database, the SAM database in this one server. Okay, so therefore I don't need to worry about setting up a user. As soon as I log into B with my credentials that are in Active Directory, my user is created on the fly with B. Obviously, this is a lot more powerful, a lot more expandable. The other good thing about domain is I can centrally manage these workstations. I can control their policies. I can control their profiles, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Profiles. So again, this is a very powerful thing. All right, so in peer-to-peer, local is stored locally. In domain, there's a central database of accounts. Now, part of this local storage, we have a name, we have a password, group memberships, profile location. We store it in what's called the SAM database. Couple of concepts here, though. First of all, the name is not directly stored in the SAM database. We have SIDS, S-I-D. security identifier. That's a randomly generated number that contains your data. All right. We also have which is tied to your username, but it's not actually your username. And also the password. The password, if you remember last lesson, we talked about encryption. The password is hashed. All right. And the cool thing about that process is when you enter in your password at the hello screen, Microsoft Hello, which we'll talk about a little bit later, you're going to put in your password. It's going to go through that same hash process. All right. It's going to go into that hash process, and a hash is going to be generated. And what happens is it's going to check that hash with the hash that's locally stored, and if the hash is matched, then we know the password's good. In other words, at no point do we store that password, all right, which is good security. Another important concept too is with the domain is the last 10 successful logins are going to be cached. So if you're on the local LAN, you log into the domain with a with a Active Directory account. Your profile, your credentials will get pushed down to the local database and cached there. Then you can unplug the laptop and take it away from the domain and log into it with that account. However, before you log in with that account, but before anyone logs into that laptop, if no one logs into it and you take that off the network, then therefore you can't log into it, right? It's going to be the last 10 successfully authenticated accounts will be saved as in the local cache, in the local database. All right. So Microsoft account. This is cloud-based. It's cloud-based authentication using Azure, A-Z-U-U-R-E, Microsoft Azure. I want to say Azure, but it's Azure. Microsoft Azure, it's cloud-based authentication, so you have multiple devices on the same account. You can log into multiple devices. As something that's on your desktop, we'll talk about the profiles. It helps sync up your profiles through the cloud, which is super cool. By default, though, you cannot use your Azure credentials to log into any laptop that can connect to Azure. There's a special option in Windows 10 that allows you to say anyone that has an Azure account can log into my laptop, which is fairly dangerous, but you can do it. You can also reset your password with second factor authentication. Factor is there's a number of factors. What you know, which is mostly what we do. Passwords is what you know. What you have. So in the case of second factor, often they use cell phones because you have your cell phone, so they'll buzz you a text. That way you gave me some kind of information like what you know, your email, what you have, your cell phone. Therefore, I can verify. I'm pretty certain I know you are who you say you are. So what else? There's what you know, what you have, what you are, which is like my fingerprint, biometrics, retinal scans, all that kind of good thing. How you act, so it can look at behaviors like the way you type. Everyone types kind of individually. Do you hold on the H key a little longer than the normal person? And factor in the fact you tap the space bar twice every time you tap it by default, or some weird thing, or how long you hold the shift key. That type of behaviors, or the way you open up a program, you always click through start, but for whatever reason, someone claiming they're you is now opening it up through the run command, which is weird, right? That's kind of what you do as well. And then there's what you are, or where you are, which is location based. Those are all different factors, but you can reset your password with second factor authentication. So in other words, not only do you have to have two of those factors. You have to know something and you have to have something. You have to know something, well, and to be honest, that's pretty much where they stop. Know something and have something. All right. Built-in cloud storage for multiple devices. Apps and family settings follow users from device to device if you allow, as long as you authenticate the first time to that. All right. So let's move on to the next slide. I got draw still on, so that's not going to move until I turn off draw. There we go. Password policies. So there are local policies. We're going to talk a lot about policies, part of auditing, but this is kind of dipping our toes in the policy pond. So there's a local security policies. They're part of a larger picture called group policy, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Just know this is kind of shoehorned in here because it fits that well. We have account policies, most importantly, password policy. By default, you're allowed the last 24 passwords are known, and they're recorded, and you can't use the entire password, a part of the password as your password. The max age is 42 by default, which is after 42 days. It should pester you to change your password. However, there's a minimum age, which by default is 0, meaning how long between you can change your passwords. So if you change your passwords, you can't change it the very same day. That's what that 0 means. Again, that's kind of a security measure, because if you change your password, why would you want to change it exactly again the same day? It's a stretch, but it's a password. It's a security measure. Minimum length, 0 essentially means you can have no password, but you could sit there and say you have to have a 6, you have to have an 8. There is a general setting called password complexity, which is disabled by default. If you do enable it, I believe it's 8 characters, alphanumeric, uppercase, lowercase, and 1 special character. So making it a little bit more challenging. And there's also a setting to store passwords with reversible encryption. As you remember, hash is not reversible. So for password recovery reasons and backwards compatibility with some corporations, this setting is still allowed. By default, it's disabled, but you can tell it not to hash the passwords, but instead to encrypt them. Just keep in mind, if you encrypt something, it can be decrypted, right? Hashing is a one-way thing. Now, later on in other security classes, we'll talk about rainbow tables and ways to crack. People say crack hashed passwords. What you're really doing is just creating a bunch of guesses, and you're going to match the guesses. But that's a different story. All right. So there's an option to store passwords with reversible encryption. The default is to disable. We also have a lockout policy. So this is how many bad guesses you get, essentially. First of all, how long do we want to lock it out? So duration is going to be how long do you want to. Whoops, I clicked it. Duration is going to be how long do you want to lock out the workstation. So if you guess X number of times, which is threshold, it'll lock you out for 30 minutes. You get 3 bad guesses, or what? Right now it's turned off. By default, it's turned off. If you turn it on, you put that to 3. You would get 3 bad guesses, and it would turn, and then no one would be able to log in for the next 30 minutes. The counter, the default is 30 minutes. That's how long before it resets the threshold back to 0. So by default, it's 30 minutes. So you get 3 bad guesses in 30 minutes. There you go. And after that, it's going to lock you out for 30 minutes. All right. So you have those 3 kind of settings under account lockout policy: duration, threshold, and counter. All right. So we have a Windows sign-on screen. It's the pretty picture with the list of accounts. Let me bring that up in my virtual machine. I'm playing with it over here. I'm going to sign out, although I think I set up the Control-Alt-Delete already as part of your lab. So that's not going to be too helpful. Let me do sign out. I'm signing out of Windows right now on my virtual machine, and this thing's going crazy. There we go. So here it is, signing out, and this is going to be the Control-Alt-Delete version, but this brings us back to the lab. If you notice, I can't make this thing go up with a click, or if I was able to, I do have a point and click monitor. I can't click and drag this up, right? You might be able to see that little light line that's bouncing around the lake right now. That's my finger going up and down. Because I have Control-Alt-Delete enabled, that was part of the lab. That's going to be part of the lab. So just know this: on your virtual machine, your real machine will intercept the Control-Alt-Delete. So if I hit Control-Alt-Delete on my keyboard right now, my real machine is going to say, "Oh, he wants Control-Alt-Delete," and bring up my task menu. In this case, if I hit Control-Alt-Delete, I want to hit Control-Delete on my virtual machine. I hit this little button. That's a sending Control-Alt-Delete to a virtual machine. Part of that is part of the security feature. All right. As you can see, I have a login here for Able Beta, which will be our power user that we're going to create, and then I got cit120 admin. So this is your Windows Hello machine. This is a Windows Hello sign on. I'm just going to log in real quick. Pound 120 pounds. ADMIN for you. Exciting. All right, we'll get that logged in. So anyway, just know that the Windows sign-in screen has a pretty picture with a list of accounts. By default, it's going to be just the local accounts. Secure sign-in, as I just showed, requires a Control-Alt-Delete. We're going to do it in the lab. You can set that in the Advanced tab of the Advanced User Accounts applet, NetPLWiz. You just hit Control-R, and you can run that. Matter of fact, I'll do it right now. So if I hit Control-R, come on. Oh, I got to get focus. I hit Control-R. Oh, Window-R. Sorry, Window-R. and I run net plwiz, hit OK, I can go to Advanced tab and turn on or off Control-Alt-Delete right there. Again, it adds security because it makes it a little bit more difficult for malware or remote sessions to automatically log in. Sending a Control-Alt-Delete over the network is a difficult task. It's not impossible. I said difficult, not impossible. So therefore, it's just adding another hurdle, right? Which most security does, just adds, varying levels of wall. Fast user switching, multiple users can log in without logging in or logging a user office, logging out, or logging a user out is what that should say. There, we'll fix that. So when you open this up, you probably logging a user out, not office. You'll see it right. There you go. That's what I like about Google Slides. All right, without logging a user out. All right, automatic sign-in, have a user log in automatically. You could do that with our good friend NetPLWiz as well. You could stop that process with a shift key. This is an important thing to memorize. If you sit down at a workstation, someone has it auto logging in as a standard user, you better know how to do this. That way you can hit the shift key and then you can log in as an administrator. We also have a thing called assigned access. It's for making Windows 10 a kiosk. We're going to talk about this a couple times. When we say a kiosk machine, we mean a machine that's going to be used for public use. Any machine for public use. So technically speaking, there's a lot of ATM machines out there that are running Windows in the background, and not Windows 10. So the newer ones tend to be running Windows 7. Some older ones are running actually older versions of Windows. Windows 2000 actually is very popular. So those are kiosk machines. The public has access to them, so we're going to lock them down and make sure they can only do a very minimal amount of things. Okay, a user can run only one app. With this assigned access, but you can use Control-Alt-Delete to get out. Notice there's no Control-Alt-Delete on the keyboards of most of any ATMs. That's not a mistake. All right, so let's talk about usernames and default user accounts. All right, first of all, username naming conventions. Usernames must be unique, so the usernames must be unique on the machine. You can't have multiple users with the same name. It has to be under 20 characters. It's not case sensitive. So like case in point, I often, when I set up my own private machines, I'm in as Jason. Whether or not, I can't set up another user with a capital J and another user with a lowercase j. It's not case sensitive. It cannot have / /, quote, left bracket, right bracket, semicolon, pipe, as I like to call it. I call the symbol a pipe. Equals, plus, asterisk, question mark, less than, greater than. Cannot have any of those characters, no matter how hard you try. All right. So let's talk about default users. So the administrator is a default user that's in Windows 10. It's the most powerful. It's not visible on the sign-in screen. By default, it has a blank password. That should be noteworthy. Cannot be deleted. That's noteworthy. Cannot be locked out. Interesting. Cannot be removed from administrators group. Can and should be disabled by default. So it's disabled by default. When Windows first comes up, let's bring up our good friend, my virtual machine over here. And I'll go to users. What happened here? Credential manager can't popped up. Close that. All right. If I click on my start menu, I want to right click on my start menu and select, we'll go computer management and go to the old school users and groups MMC, which is right here. And double click on users. As you can see right here, the administrator account is right there and it's disabled. Okay, so it comes by default disabled. It should be renamed. So standard practice in a lot of places when they set up images or gold standards or whatever it is, when they set up machines, sysprep machines, what they do is they rename the administrator and then put a new password on there, a very long and big complex password, but it's still disabled. It is meant to be the ultimate backdoor. That's the point of it, is to be a backdoor. So anyway, so there you go. So that's the administrator account. It cannot be removed from the administrators group, which we'll talk about next lesson when we talk about groups. Guest is the least powerful, cannot be deleted or locked out. Disabled with blank password by default. It can be renamed. Member of the guest and everyone group. The important thing is that last one right there. It's a member of the guest and everyone group. So if you go to, we haven't talked about file permissions yet, but if you go into a file permission, you'll see that unless there's the everyone group, all right. So let me rephrase this and rephrase it in a more direct way. If the everyone group is listed in the as users with access to it, then guest or guest itself, or the guest group as well, then guests will have rights to whatever rights there are to it. Otherwise than that, it will not. It's not a member of users, so it doesn't have the same rights as users. So it gets its permissions from the everyone group and the guest group. Okay. All right. There's also the initial account, which is when you're installing it, you're prompted for a account that will become the administrator group. It's visible on sign-on. Has a password by default. It can be deleted, can be locked out, can be removed from administrator's group. So people that tend to use the initial account for day-to-day will often set up the machine, get all the software they want installed in there, at least a base to start there, and then will remove that account from the administrators group so they can then have that account as their everyday account. It is recommended that whatever account you use for day-to-day operations is not a member of the administrators group. You don't want, we'll talk about that again in authorization. But you don't want to go around day in and day out as an administrator. And finally, we have this account. It's a weird account. Let me show it. Actually, here it is. It's called the default account. As you can see, it's disabled right here. Do not play with it. It is used for system use, so just keep it disabled and keep it there. But the Windows 10 uses it for background processes. So. All right, we have managing user accounts. So one can use the user accounts applet and control panel, or the users groups MMC to create or modify user accounts. That's what I'm using right here. This is the MMC. The new way to do it is, of course, settings, because Windows is getting away from control panel. So let me just type in users. So you type user in, and then you'll get, add, edit, or remove other people. This is the user account. Right now I have the user that's from our lab that I was working on. So you can add a user. This is far more inhibiting. So it's going to start off with trying to set up a Azure account. You would have to go through and try to set it up as a local, add a user without a Microsoft account right here, this little option down here. In other words, this is more for Azure, for a user that doesn't understand how users are set up in Microsoft, right? That's kind of what this is for. This interface right here goes back a long time. All right, this goes back to NT4 to Windows 95. This is the MMC interface. If I want to create a user, I can just simply right-click on here and do New User. I can also go to Action New User as well, I believe. Yep, Action New User. And then type in all this information. If you notice right here, we have, so let me just real quick just to set a test one up here. All right, I'll set the password as, guess what, test. All right, so user must change password at this login. I can unselect that. Notice when I select user cannot change password, this gets grayed out, which kind of makes sense. In the good old days, back in NT4, we could select them both on, put them both on and set up a catch-22, which was always fun. I can also tell the password never expires. I can also disable the account as well. All those options are here available to me. I can also edit current users that are in here. So let's take a look at ABC Power Users, PU. I can change your membership, so what groups you're in. Oh, that's funny. I think she's supposed to be in Power Users. So I'll fix that. So there you go. I just added her to Power Users. We'll talk about permissions and why having her in both empower users and users is okay. It won't be inhibiting her. I could change her profile here. So I could change where her profile, the local path is, or the local path for the profile is. So anyway, that's the user interface. Actually, did I just cancel out of that? So I lost all my work. I wanted to save that, but that's fine. Anyway, so that is the user's MMC. Whoops. Really? Case sensitive. No. Power users. Right. Oh, I'm pluralizing powers for some reason. I'm stuck in the Marvel Cinematic Universe or something. There we go. Power users. So let me hit apply and then okay. All right. Sorry to waste your time there. All right. So anyway, so we got the user account applet, which is pretty. Local user and group snap-in, less pretty. Account name, full name, description. User must change password next login. These are all things that I just showed you. So moving along. All right, let's talk about profiles. So the profile in Windows 10 is going to be located in the C drive. Well, excuse me, in the system drive. All right, it doesn't have to be the C drive. In this case, it is in the C drive. Users, and then the username itself. Notice ABC PU is not here, even though she's a legitimate user on this machine, because she hasn't logged in. If she does log in, then that profile will be created. All right, so if I go into cit120.authen, who I am currently logged in as, this is the current profile. All right, the big folder in here, which is a hidden folder, by the way, if I do view and I take away hidden items, it'll disappear. The big folder here is app data. This is where we're supposed to keep our data for our various applications that we use. It's supposed to be used as a repository. Now, the important thing to think about profiles are where we customize Windows. We talked a little bit about the registry, and that's true. The registry, we do a lot of customization of Windows there too. But this as well, this is what makes it feel home. This is a home base for the user, okay? This is where the documents in my documents reside, right? This is where the downloads folder resides, right? That kind of stuff. You can see all these little test files I have in here. This is where my desktop folder comes. All right. So anyway, long story short, this is where users can really personalize Windows is with the profiles. So let's talk about some of the files and folders. App data, a hidden folder containing user-specific information for applications. We have some folders that are here for backwards compatibility. Application data is one of them. It's like app data. It actually all it does is point to app data, but older programs back in the Windows 2000, Windows XP days had this thing called application space data. And so some programs still try to write to that area. If it does, it just takes it, says okay, and it says it's going to write the application data, but in actuality it writes the app data. All right. There's a contacts folder, which is if you're going to use contacts, use Microsoft's contact folder system. We have cookies, which is for Internet Explorer, which means it's now Kaplunk. The Microsoft Edge uses app data, and of course Chrome uses app data to store its cookies now. Desktop, we know what desktop is, I hope. Desktop is the folder that has all the shortcuts for Windows. So if I go in here and I go into desktop and I put create a new text document called, well, it's already popped up. Surprise! Surprise! Put an exclamation point too. Surprise! There it is. The file pops up instantly on my desktop, and if I delete it, it goes away. And since I just hit delete, it went into the recycle bin. But anyway, so that's the desktop folder. We have the documents folder, downloads folder, favorites, which again was for Internet Explorer favorites. Again, Edge uses app data for that now, so it's kind of defunct. Links was a folder in Windows 8 that contained links that were displayed as favorites in File Explorer. It's not used in Windows 10. Local settings, a hidden shortcut that's included for backwards compatibility. Congratulations for applications. We also have music. We have My Documents, or Documents. Actually, My Documents is a misnomer. It's not called that anymore. I still call it because I'm old. NetHood, which is a hidden shortcut, which shows what we see on the network. We're going to talk about that later on in networking with Windows, where we have sharing. We have the OneDrive folder, which is a folder that's synchronized to cloud storage, Microsoft OneDrive. We have a pictures folder. Again, it's just a folder that's meant to hold pictures. Print hood is for printing information. Recent saved games, which is for the game system, and search is a folder that saves search queries so that you can click on them again. All right. Some other things that are in there that you can play with are send2, which I think we already played with. Send2 is a folder that you can put shortcuts for programs and send it to that program. The start menu is a hidden icon. It's there for backwards compatibility. This is not where you do the start menu anymore in the profile. Templates, another hidden shortcut. That's again for backwards compatibility. Videos, a folder for storing videos. All right, so a couple, now some really important technical information. We have ntuser.dat. Now, ntuser.dat, as you can see, is actually a rather large file. That's a whole meg over there. Well, a large file back in the good old days. If I send that over to Notepad, okay, yeah, you can't. That's right, you can't grab it because you can only look at it if you have it open in another operating system. It's in use by the registry. This is the file that loads in the data, a lot of it, to HKey local user in the registry. All right, so that data gets loaded in from ntuser.dat. So this is a really important file. A lot of this file keeps the settings that makes Windows personalized to that user. All right. There's a couple other files that go kind of along with it. There's a temporary file used for controlling for showing the registry changes. This stuff is really important if you're doing forensics on a Windows box. So that's well, I mean, not really important, but it's a perhaps might give you a clue as far as malware being installed because it's looking for registry changes when you're dealing with forensics. So that'll be a later course. And then we have ntuser.ini, a file that controls which portions of a profile are not to be copied when the server when we're dealing with a roaming profile, which we're about to talk about. So ntuser.dat is a file that stores user-specific registry information, and ntuser.ini simply is a file that tells what should and shouldn't be copied up to a roaming profile. Well, what is a roaming profile? Let's talk about special types of profiles. We have 4 special types of profiles. We have the default profile, all right, which is right here. As you can see, it's hidden. The default profile is the template. It is when a new user is being created, it's going to get copied over. That's what it's there for. So that default profile, here's my poor drawing of a file folder. Kind of almost looks like a boat. All those settings when a new user gets created, so in that case, if I log in as ABC over here, when ABC is created, her profile, which is AB, and it was C like the ocean, fitting for my boat-looking folders, ABC, when that gets copied over, right, it's going to start off with that default profile. That default profile is what gets copied over. So the important thing there is, let me get out of draw mode, and let me get back over to here. So the important thing there, if I go into the default profile, which I'm not supposed to do, by the way, I mean, I could go in and do simple things like add stuff in the document, right, in the desktop. So if I click on a new folder here called, whatever, storage, right? So I create that folder. Notice it doesn't pop up on my desktop, my cit120 admin, right? There's a good reason for that, right? It's because it only gets copied over when the user gets created, right? Now, so I'm going to call this test 1 just for giggles. So we're going to call that test 1, all right? So, yes, continue. All right, I got to send my second token. We'll talk about that in authorization. All right, so so there you go. I'm setting up my, so you're supposed to use sysprep to modify the default profile. You can do small things like adding folders and shortcuts. This, again, will only get applied when a new user is being created, all right? Let's jump down to the public profile because this is kind of the antithesis of default. So the public profile, going back over here, operates quite differently, all right? So if I go to the public profile and I go to the public desktop and I put a folder there, notice it pops up immediately on my desktop, test 2, right? That's that folder right there. So this is meant as kind of a sharing area. Now also keep in mind too, is if I'm an administrator and I have rights to, let's say, rename this. So if I hit F2 and I rename it test 23 or 23, I have to have administrative rights to do this. It's going to change it for everyone. All right, so now it's going to be called test 23. Or if there's a document in there, it's going to change it for everyone. So it's meant for sharing. It's not everyone gets their own copy. It's a central repository that shows up in everyone's desktop. Does that make? Hopefully that makes sense. So that's the whole point of public, right? So public profile not assigned to any user for all users, desktop, start menu, etc. You can, well, start menu less so nowadays, but for the desktop or for documents, you can have it as a central area for sharing, for co-working on pieces of paper. Default gets copied over when a user is created, so there's a big difference, okay? Also, we have mandatory profiles, which what happens is the changes that go into the registry, so you can do it, you can change the wallpaper, you can change the layout of startup, you can change various things, especially stuff that goes into the registry, but those changes won't be saved. The next time the system reboots, it's going to bring it back to how it was. One of the first steps you do to make a mandatory profile is you change the nt-user.dat to nt-user.man. That kind of locks it in stone, and that's why the changes don't get saved. All right. There's more steps to it than that. It's not that simple, but that's called a mandatory profile. Also, we have a roaming profile where it's a domain profile that gets downloaded from the Active Directory server. It also gets synced up to the domain profile. So if you the first time you log onto a machine, it's going to go up to the Active Directory server, download that user's profile, put it in. That way the user has all the files and folders in the desktop they like. And then if they make any changes, when those changes are automatically pushed up to the Active Directory. If you're away from the Active Directory and you make changes to your profile, then show back up, plug it in, it's going to resync it up. The files with the latest modifications, are going to win, and so the changes will get pushed up. So those are the 4 special profiles you need to know. Default, which is the template for when new users are created. Mandatory, where it's a profile where changes aren't saved. Roaming profile, where domain profiles are downloaded from Active Directory server. And a public profile, which is not assigned to any user, but is assigned to all users. All users can get the files and folders in that area. So a desktop full file will show up on all desktop files. To manage profiles, be sure to turn on the show hidden files and folders. And you go to the, well, in this case, I did the system drive, the same drive as Windows users, and the name of the profile. Unless you changed it. Remember I showed you in the user's MMC where you can change that too. You don't have to accept the profile to be in the default place. To make a roaming profile, you can use the user accounts applet, configure advanced user profiles. So start menu, earlier versions of Windows made modifying the start menu easier. In Windows 10, the easiest way is to go through the profile. All right. Let's talk about advanced authentication with Windows. We could do a password picture to unlock. It's fairly secure. Again, that comes into the category of what you know, but essentially it will give you a picture on your screen, whatever. Let's say your favorite, a map of Disneyland, and then you can kind of circle your favorite rides, right? Or you could draw the path you usually go if you're one of these fanatics that like to go to Disney World every year. The path you always walk along Disney World, right? We also have the PIN system, which is meant as a quick authentication. It's a smaller number-based PIN. Personally, I use a 9-number PIN. So the initial login, you use a full password, but when you're unlocking your screen, you can just use a PIN to unlock it, so it's quicker. We have the Windows Hello screen, which does biometrics like fingerprint readers and facial recognition, iris scanner. That goes in the category of what you are. Of course, all these things are relatively cheap. They're not industrial level, shall we say, that comes along with your laptop, right? So there's going to be a lot of false positives and false negatives, and manufacturers would rather have too many false positives. That way people will actually use them. If you give too many false negatives, people would get really annoyed at the fingerprint reader and just stop using it, right? So keep that in mind. You can also use multi-factor authentication, MFA, especially if you have smart cards. Smart cards is a device that gives you a one-time code that you can type in and it syncs it up. That goes in the category of what you have. And then we have Microsoft Passport, which will use keys which are stored in the TMP chip on your motherboard. Or TPM. See, that's a typo. That should be TPM. Chip on your motherboard. All right, so that wraps up authentication. So there's a lab to go along with this, of course, and I'll talk to you in the next presentation. Thank you.